Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon-Muñiz. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. We are very excited because we're going to talk about a little bit about what makes us who we are. So today we're going to be talking about the theories of personality. Very exciting. We are moving out of the, so for those who are just joining us for this podcast, a little bit out of order, we're going through the AAMC Psych outline. And so we're giving you some shortened versions of some of the topics. We're not going, full depth into everything because there's a lot that you need to know, right? And also just for your sanity and ours, we want to make sure that we keep these podcasts, a decent length without spending, 3 hours on one topic, which can easily be done for some of these topics. So today we are stepping into 7A. We are not covering all of 7A. We're not even covering all of the different theories of personality today, because as you can imagine, there are quite a few. So we'll be hitting a few of them today. And then next episode, we'll go through some of the rest. Just keep in mind that we will let you know when we're hitting something very high level, and we'll, tell you, okay, you need to go also review this a little bit more in depth because you're fairly likely to see it on test day. Keep in mind that in general, some of these will be higher yield than others. Some of them you're just going to see more often. And so those are the ones that we'll spend a little bit more time on. So go ahead and I'll let you talk and get us started, Phil.
No, yeah, I completely agree with everything you're saying there. I just want to reiterate, we're in 7A now, which is awesome because we're making some real progress. There's 6 ABC, 7 ABC, 8 ABC, 9A, 9B, and then 10A. I don't know why it wasn't 9 ABC. That would have been nice. But the symmetry in me, the OCPD in me is a little bit, it's a little bit out there. But just to be clear, there's some stuff in 7A that we are jumping over right at the beginning. And so we're jumping to personality. The reason we're doing that is because there are some images that are or some topics that are really hard to explain without images. And this is a podcast format. Note that we do go over those. I personally lecture over every single topic in the psych outline in the course. But in the course, obviously there's images and things that you can kind of do there. And so we're going to start off with the big one, the big, founding, forceful part of psychology, which is the psychoanalytics, namely Freud, right? So you can't talk psychology without talking Freud. And so we're going to start talking today about personality and Freud's perspective on this and the psychoanalytic perspective. The big thing for Freud is that stuff is below the surface, right? There are things going on in our heads that we are not aware of. We have things going on in our subconscious. It's really interesting. If I had a problem and I went to Freud and I'm like, listen, Freud, I'm having such a hard time at work. My boss doesn't really understand what I'm good at. And so he has me keep doing these repetitive tasks that really aren't helping the company, but there's this other thing that we should be doing. And I just feel like no one's listening to me. And my girlfriend doesn't really understand, or my significant other doesn't really understand when I try to talk to them. Freud would say, shut up, tell me about your mother, right? That's what's going on with Freud. According to Freud, your problems are not the things that you think are your problems. Your problems are under the surface. Your problems are things rooted in your subconscious mind, things that you are not even aware of, things buried in your psyche that you probably need help to analyze and determine those. Hence, you need a psychoanalyst. You need someone to do the deep dive in there. And so Freud has, I want to be clear, Freud has a lot of stuff to talk about. We could probably talk for an entire semester's worth of lectures on just Freud, let alone the psychoanalyst, but just Freud himself. And so we're not going to go into some of the stuff with some of the other topics. We're going to kind of start though with what I think is one of the most critical portions of Freud and one of the highest yield for the MCAT, which is something related to his iceberg model.
Yeah. So I love that you also said dive, because immediately my mind went to the iceberg and I was just like, okay, we're going to dive into
It's going to be
the
cold.
waters. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe a little too cold. We're heading into fall, some places trying to get a little bit chillier.
Yeah, I'm just thinking iceberg. Like, I don't want to dive in anywhere with icebergs.
Mm-hmm. So Freud had this, so kind of thinking about the iceberg, Freud divided this iceberg into 3 different components. And then within those components, they span different layers of the mind. So starting with the layers of the mind. So we have the unconscious, right? These repressed thoughts, often very negative. It might be some of the traumatic events down there in that unconscious, but it's just stuff that is out of reach of your conscious mind. So you're not registering these things. That's the key point. Then there's this pre-conscious layer, right? And so it's something that could become conscious. So it could move into this realm where you are aware of it. And then, as the name implies, right, as most of you are expecting, is the conscious mind. And so you can reach for this. You can actively think about this. It's the way that you understand the world actively, right? So
I think the reason he did the iceberg thing is because icebergs are mostly below the water. And so he looked at our mind as kind of the similar thing, is most of it's buried underneath. And so it's all his analogy for understanding the mind.
Yeah. And so the different components of ourselves, right, are going to span these different layers of the mind. And so again, kind of like Phil pointed out, a lot of this is outside of our conscious reach, right? So we said we kind of went up into the realm of the consciousness. So most of it is underwater, right? Most of it is this unconscious layer. And so a lot of what we'll be talking about will specify whether it's, conscious or unconscious. We'll primarily use those differentiators. So we have 3 components, right, of, in a sense, who we are. So there's the superego, the ego, and the id. And so we'll talk about each of them individually. We'll start with the superego, right? So the superego, let's think about how it spans on this iceberg. So the superego, and I don't know why today I keep kind of going in the opposite direction. So, I'm starting at the bottom, but the superego is actually going to span all 3 layers of consciousness. And so what's really cool about the superego is if you think about this iceberg, and I know it's a podcast form, so bear with us. If you think about this iceberg, just split it in half vertically. Right. And so I like to think one side is entirely the superego, right? And so that way you can picture it spanning all 3 of the vertical layers. And so this superego is folks think of as the little angel on your shoulder, right? In the sense that it's your ideal version, right? It's the perfectionist. It's the one that is, it's following societal rules, right? And it's this just fantastic version of yourself. And so that's the superego. The superego is who we strive to be. So I think Phil and I have different examples that we like. I really like cookies. So in case you haven't noticed, I'm a sweets person. So I'm sure you guys have picked that up across the podcast. But the superego is saying, okay, this is not healthy. It's not, you can't just constantly eat cookies. It's also not acceptable. And so the superego is going to say, stop reaching for the cookie jar. You don't need it. This is just, it's not part of your ideal self. So alas, as the superego, I don't get to have my cookies 24/7.
Right. Yeah. I always like to think of the superego as your Jiminy Cricket, just the little voice in your ear saying you shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing that. And that's makes sense because the superego is partially conscious. And so when you hear these things feel guilty about doing something that I shouldn't have, that guilt is coming from the superego. The superego is, like you said, kind of the idealized version of yourself. It can be a little bit unrealistic at times. If sticking with the cookie thing, if I'm at a retirement party for a coworker, right, and the coworker hasn't arrived yet, my superego says, okay, don't eat any of the cookies, wish this person a happy retirement. And then after work, instead of driving home, you should jog because that's better for the environment and it's better for you. It's 10 miles. That's kind of long. So you can take a stop at the homeless shelter. That's about halfway and you can donate all your money because that's the right thing to do, to help, and be charitable. And you can't actually live in your complete superego because it can be a little bit hard to live up to. Now, so there's this superego on the other side, you have the id. And a lot of students, a lot of people want to think, well, if the superego is the angel on your shoulder, then your id is the devil on your shoulder that's telling you to do bad stuff. But that's not really super accurate. The id is more about these like base urges. The id is about like if you're at that retirement party, like your id like doesn't want you to like go around punching people, right? Like your id wants you to like eat all the cookies and then find like, you know, your new coworker who you think is attractive and then go find a closet to make out in. And so it's all about like sex drives and food drives, those animalistic urges that do exist. Now, the id exists entirely in the subconscious. So it is completely below the water in the iceberg model. I do want to kind of pause for a second on this iceberg thing. I know you guys might be like, why do we keep talking about this like iceberg image? Like, why don't we just talk about like, you know, conscious, subconscious? There are very few like images and metaphors that I've seen the MCAT ask specifically about, but I've heard of them asking specifically about the iceberg image of like knowing like where each object is here on the structure. And so if you take your iceberg and you divide it right down the middle, and you know one side is the superego, the other side it can be divided into the ego and the id, and the id is like entirely below the surface. It's like the bottom corner of your iceberg here.
Yeah. And kind of thinking along, so you mentioned the id and what the id wants you to do. I like to just think of it as the id wants you to reproduce, right? Mm-hmm. Anything that is functional for and promotes reproduction is going to be the id. So, you know, like with the example of the cookies, the id just wants you to get the, you know, nutrients, which not a very balanced set of nutrients, but it's got some in there. I stand by cookies. So it just wants you to get the nutrients to be able to continue reproducing. Right. And so I really like that you pointed out that it's not like the little devil on your shoulder. Right. So it's just something that promotes that, you know, drive. It's that animalistic component. And so now we kind of have these two extremes, right? So you have this super ego that is idealized, that sometimes it's out of reach. And, you know, you don't really want to jog home 10 miles. Like that's a lot, right? But then you also don't want to completely give in to the id, because then that's not societally acceptable. It's not the best version of yourself, right? So you need something in between. You need something to mediate. And so enter the ego. So the ego is the mediator, right? So it's going to say, okay, like what is both useful and feasible, right? So in that example, it's useful and feasible to wait until the coworker arrives before eating, you know, cookies, right? You have that sort of self-control. It's, you know, it's socially acceptable, but also, like you're just not sitting there eating a ton of cookies. But then the ego is going to say, okay, well, I can't jog home. Like some of you, let me specify. Some of you may be able to jog 10 miles, right? Some of us cannot. We're not built that way. We're not trained that way.
Right.
So our egos are going to say, okay, that's not going to happen. That's not feasible. But maybe in the morning, right, I can take a shorter walk and kind of have that that interplay. So the ego then has to have some component, if you think about it, right, in that subconscious that Phil mentioned, but it also has to have a component in the conscious mind, because we're able to reason these things out, right? So we're able to say, okay, this is like in an ideal world, I could do this, but because we're not in an ideal world, right, enter the ego, I'm going to modify my actions appropriately. So the ego then is really cool because it has to mitigate also the stress, right? This tension between the id and the superego. And so this is one of those things that you'll want to review kind of on your own afterwards. But the ego is going to use defense mechanisms to reduce that stress and to reduce that conflict between the id and the superego. So something to keep in mind. There are also other components that, you know, we're going to get to in a second that you do need to review with respect to Freudian psychoanalytic theory, but that's the base, no pun intended, of the iceberg presentation of Freud's id, ego, and superego.
Yeah. So just to review, the superego is in all three layers, the subconscious, preconscious, and conscious mind. The ego is also in all three layers. The id is completely subconscious. Yeah. I always like to think about like the ego is trying to do that balance between the two where like, I'm going to wait till the person arrives, eat a cookie, drive home, maybe go for a walk. And if I see a homeless man, I'll give him like $5, right? Like maybe there's some kind of like balance between these. I do like that you mentioned that there's like defense mechanisms. There's a whole lot of stuff going on with Freud, and the defense mechanisms are things that you do need to review. Also stuff with the different stages of development and libido, like the anal oral stage, that sort of stuff. It's kind of interesting. There's a good chance that like everyone like listening, there's a good chance you have heard the term anal retentive or like used that term yourself. That's actually a Freudian thing that has to do with an issue occurring in the anal stage of development. But we're not going to go into this because like I said, we could talk for like 10 hours on just Freud, and that would not be like cracking the iceberg. Like that would be just a part of it. Now, there are things you do need to know for the MCAT, but we want to, kind of like make some progress here in this like understanding of personality. So you can always look at the AAMC outline that we have, and then we also in the course I go do a deep dive on all of these things as well. But another view outside of the psychoanalytic is the humanistic perspective. The humanistic perspective basically is looking at you as like you're human. Like we want to be good, but there are challenges that arise, and like sometimes we might need help getting over those challenges. Pretty like core to the idea. Like if there's a Freud for the humanistic perspective, it's Carl Rogers. Rogers is one of the fundamental humanistic psychologists out there. And so there's a couple things kind of interesting about Rogers. And so one of them is like, what's the difference between going and talking to Freud, who's going to tell me to just shut up and tell me about your mother? If I go and do the same thing with Rogers, like I'm having trouble at work and blah, 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 Rogers is going to say, tell me more about that. How does that make you feel? That like patient-centric therapy or human-centric, with the idea that like you probably know more about what's going on with you than I do. And so like I'm going to let you kind of like lead the therapy, and we're going to kind of like talk about this, and maybe I can offer some insight and clarity and like, kind of like pull this stuff apart. I think when most people think therapy, they're thinking humanistic therapy, this like patient-centric thing. The big thing with all of the humanists is that they're looking for that there's this chase for self-actualization, which is being the best version of yourself that you can be, right? Now, I want to be clear, in like Western society, like the best version of myself, a lot of times people imagine like the most powerful, the richest, right? I want to be Jeff Bezos / president at the same time. Like that would be the best version of me. Like that's not really what the humanists mean when they say you become self-actualized. What they mean is you are living I hate to go into like hashtags, but like live your best life sort of thing, where you are fulfilled. You're engaged, and so you have a good social life, and you feel like you are not morally compromised. You can pursue your interests. And so like somebody who is self-actualized could be like a history teacher who like, that they're not going to be like loaded, but like they've got a decent job and they love teaching and coaching, baseball. Like after during the school year, and they have kids and a wife at home, and yeah, they're not rich, but every summer he gets the summer off, and so they go for like the whole family goes to visit national parks all over the city, and he feels like he can pursue his hobbies and interests. He's got good relationships with his family and friends, and that could be a self-actualized person. And so it doesn't necessarily mean wealthy, powerful, rich, which is kind of how a lot of like Western society views success. And so it's looking at success in a slightly different way.
Yeah. And you actually started hinting at something really important, right? There are different types of needs that people have in order to live this self-actualized, really fulfilled life. And so enter, right, Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs, which I suspect a number of you have heard of. If you took any sort of psych in high school or undergrad, right, it would have come up. And so the idea being there's this pyramid. right? And so you think, okay, so you have a very wide base, right? And as you go up, it gets narrower, just the anatomy of a pyramid. And so at the base, right, the most important, the foundational components are the needs that need to be met first. So you can't just jump to the top of the pyramid, right? You have to work your way up and meet needs before being able to truly meet something that is higher up. So the most important, basic, fundamental need are your physiological needs, right? Do you have, are you able to have water, right? Do you have food? Like these very, the things that you need to absolutely survive, right? Without these, there's nothing else. So you have these physiological needs, right? And then you have to add another component. So now you need safety, right? So are you going to be able to, be safe enough to go to sleep, right? And then wake up in the morning without something awful happening. And so you have these, you're layering these needs on top of one another. So now you have this safety component. So once you feel safe, right, you can work on things like love, like feeling like you belong somewhere. And so like, if you think about this, right, let's say you're in class. And so just kind of generalizing love as much as possible. If you're worried about being hungry and you feel like there is a threat in the room, right? You're not going to be thinking, okay, I love talking to this person. They're fantastic. Your mind's like, I need to shut my stomach up. I need to get food somehow. I need to get out of this unsafe scenario. And so that's why you have to build off of the needs and meet the physiologic and the safety needs first before you're able to meet the need of, love and having these interactions with other people. And so once you have this general sense of like love and belonging, we have esteem, right? And so, how do you see yourself? Right. So you have to start incorporating, okay, I have like my base needs met. And do I like who I am? Right. So once you've done that, you can work towards this peak, this ideal self-actualized version of yourself. And so, thinking about the example that Phil gave with the history teacher, they have their partner, right? They have all of these things going on at home. They're able to go on these vacations. They, coach a sports team. If they're worried about their safety, they can't go coach that team, right? They're going to be worried about their partner and their children, et cetera. If they're not eating, right? If they don't have the basic necessities of life, they're not going to be going on vacation, right? That's why we redistribute, for example, our finances to swing over and meet those base needs before, you go on vacation. Ideally, right?
If you're starving to death, don't take a vacation, buy food.
Yes, please. And so what's really cool is that, we talk a lot about these theories and we talk a lot about these psych topics. And you guys know that, we try and bring them back to your future careers. We try and bring them back to everyday life. And this is something that I think gets forgotten in medical school, that you have to meet these base needs before you can start living your best med school life. So as you study for the MCAT, as you transition into medical school, please make sure that you are taking care of your base needs before, you focus so much on school that now you're not eating and you're sick and then you can't focus on school at all. So just a little plug for self-care thrown into the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, that's something that definitely does get neglected. I will admit that. The thing with the pyramid is just the idea that, like, if you wanted to build a pyramid, you can't start at the bottom or start at the top. You got to start at the bottom. You got to work your way up. And I think like the clearest level is this like physical and then safety thing. Like if you have food, if you have water, if you have everything you need to survive, you're never going to, say, attack a rhino with a stick, right? Because that would be stupid and that would not be safe. But on the other hand, if you were starving, yeah, all of a sudden my safety is not as important. And so I might do that. Like if I was actually starving to death, there's a rhino and I have a stick, I'm going to go try to kill that rhino so I can have something to eat. And so this idea of like the physical is more important than the safety. And so you got to get the physical stuff first before you can move on to the safety. And you got to kind of like work your way up through this, eventually getting towards that self-actualization. There's a lot of different people in these categories. I think, we talked about the psychoanalysts, we talked about Freud. Like there's also, I think it's pronounced Jung, but it's spelled Jung. So Jung. It's very, very confusing. who's also another famous psychoanalyst. Erickson is a psychoanalyst, and there's a lot of stuff to know with them. The humanists, you have like Rogers and Maslow, and there's some things to know there. And you want to be kind of comfortable with these. I think overall, though, having a good understanding of like what is it that the psychoanalysts care about, what is it that the humanists care about, I think that will take you pretty far. I also liked how you tried to bring this back to like the students, like medical students, and like what are they worried about. I think it's also kind of an interesting thing to think not just about the people who are going to be doctors, but who they are treating. You're helping them most of the time in their physical needs. Like they can't walk, they've got pain that's so intense that they can't take care of themselves, like make sure they have shelter and that sort of stuff. And like you just kind of like dealing with that physical. There are other layers to that, depending on what kind of physician you become. Obviously, if you go into psych, like you're going to be worried more about that like third and fourth levels, which is like socialization and then like esteem, like your relationships with other people, and then your relationship with yourself. But like understanding kind of like where your role is, you kind of think of yourself as a physician as trying to help your patients get to that self-actualization, depending on whatever it is that you're specifically working on. Obviously, self-care is important, but it goes beyond that, into the larger realm as well of like trying to help not just yourself become self-actualized, but everyone. That's something I think all the humanists would get behind.
Yeah, and just kind of continuing that train of thought, like who you're going to be helping, right? There are also different, like if you think about it, within these categories, there are different, like almost sub layers, right? Just in terms of our everyday life. So if a patient comes, right, and they have this knee pain or whatever they might have, and they're unable to walk, right? That is a physical component that is important to them. But if they don't have the basic resources to get to their appointments, right? If they don't have insurance, then at that point, it's kind of a battle between, okay, am I going to be able to pay, to have the food that I need versus being able to go to the doctor and get this pain sorted out. So there's still that very important, like the absolute basics that you have to get covered. And that's why, that's why they say all the time that medicine is an interpersonal, like a team-based effort, right? And so you have these interprofessional, that was the word I was looking for, interprofessional relationships that are so important. And so I just also want to plug that, working with social workers, working with nurses, with therapists, with occupational therapists, all of that is so important. So as you kind of prepare to go into medicine and your careers, keep that in the back of your mind. I think that that's something that it's really easy to forget. And we get so focused on, okay, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be the best doctor I can be, but also who you're working with. So there's, the three components: who you're going to be, who you're going to be helping and working with in terms of patient-doctor relationship, but also who you're going to be working with in terms of your peers. So just something to be mindful of. But yes, you have to build off of this hierarchy.
I love that idea of like looking at, the patients as what they're struggling with as well. And this is something that has happened to, I think, pretty much every physician I know of, where they have a patient and they're like, why didn't you come in sooner? Like they're like we could have done, like the outcomes would have been so much better. And it's because like a large portion of the population, I have to like be very careful not to get on my soapbox about like public health and, like what's going on with the healthcare industry. But there's a lot of people out there that are struggling to meet just those basic fundamental needs, like to make sure that they have food for, their children, and like, shelter, that they can afford their rent and things like that. And note that if you're concerned with that, you are not concerned with your safety. And so there are people who have like issues. Like I think that there's something going on with my GI system. I got this weird mole on my back that's growing kind of strangely. But like I have to go to work. I can't take a day off work because I need to make sure that I can buy food for my kids, that I can buy shelter. And so then you end up with these scenarios where like, because safety got pushed down the road because the fundamental needs weren't met, that becomes like a problem. And like, if they had, if safety had been able to be a higher priority for them, then the outcomes would have been much better. I can feel myself getting angry. There's like scenarios and people that I've met, and I'm just like, I just wish the scenarios were different. And if your fundamental like physical needs were met, then you would have been more aware and more concerned with like the safety side of things. And so that's always something to think of as well, not just with like the people you're working with, but like as society at large and where the holes are. And so it's another interesting thought there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as we kind of, wrap up talking about the hierarchy of needs and humanist perspective and the personality, different theories of personality, we always try and tie these things back because we think that it's important. And so, yes, we're here to help engage you in your learning of the psych topics and of the MCAT in general and preparing. But, you guys are going into an important field that has the potential to impact, like Phil said, the greater societal world that we live in. So I just want to say thank you for staying tuned for this end part of the podcast, because it's a testament to you're going into the right thing, right? You're going into the right field. You care about people. That's a good sign. But also just thank you for joining us on this introduction to 7A, for joining us on this introduction to theories of personality. Stay tuned for next podcast next week as we continue the different theories of personalities, and then we continue onward into the rest of some other high points of 7A.